Hi, I'm Sebastian, and I'm going to be explaining the difference between exploitation and exploration in novels of ideas according to Donald Nordberg. Very quickly, the novel of ideas is a term given to a book by critics whenever the story at play is equal to or less important than the philosophy that's portraying. They separate themselves from philosophical essays by being works of fiction, but they maintain explanatory elements from the essay through monologues and flat characters and setting in order to greater portray the philosophy at the heart of it. Nordberg establishes his thesis by quoting Anthony Quinton, saying that he speaks of philosophy in fiction, where the ideas are expressed indirectly and the content is latent, and philosophy through fiction, where imaginative literary works communicate philosophical concepts that are already fully worked out. This highlights his two categorical differences in novels of ideas, exploitation and exploration. Exploitation is all about philosophical ideas that have been fully worked out. It goes into greater depth about whatever philosophy the novel possesses, but in doing so flattens the characteristics of the story itself. Characters become more shallow, and the setting of the story is very different for the real world in order to lend itself more towards the explanation of whatever philosophy it's describing. An example Nordberg uses is 1984, as Winston himself is not a very complex character in order to allow for more room for the actual discussion at hand, which is individualism versus collectivism. The character is more of a mouthpiece or device for the author to intrude upon the story in order to give his beliefs, opinions, and values. Other books that Nordberg puts in this category of exploitation are the following. Look at them. Have you read them before? Some criticism leveled against novels of ideas in its exploitative nature are that the flatter characters limits the form of the novel itself and ultimately leads to intellectual dishonesty. The form of the novel is to dissolve all theory into personal relationships, which the novel of ideas does not do in its exploitative nature. Exploration does not rely on or exploit pre-established philosophy. Instead, it delves into new ideas without scope. That is to say that conclusions for these new ideas are often ambiguous or even non-existent. These works don't use characters as mouthpieces for established competing philosophies, but instead to explore what these approaches mean to the characters standing in for real people, as they seek to draw sense from confusion. And end quote. It's done. Books that fall into this category can be Atonement or White Noise, because the worlds there don't really follow the same rules as the real world does, similar to the exploitative ones, but the philosophy isn't in place of characterization. The characters are still themselves complex and stand-ins not for the author, but for real people. Explorative novels of ideas, because of they are ambiguous, can often fall in line with anti-plot kinds of books, ones where it's just winding stream of consciousness, things like The Catcher in the Rye or Albert Camus' The Stranger. Of course, Nordberg, in making the distinction between explorative and exploitative novels of ideas, has to backpedal a little bit and say that these aren't black and white, and that books and novels can exist in between the two categories, taking elements from one and the other. Why should we care? This is a genre that is decided retroactively by critics and not even by the original authors. A writer can decide that their book will be sci-fi, but a writer cannot decide that their book will be a novel of ideas. What is the point of a distinction also if these books don't even follow the rules that he establishes in 9 pages worth of writing? Well, the reason is documentation. Nordberg claims that the style of the novel of ideas reflects the technological and social developments of the time of their publishing. Sure, published post-World War II, 1984 encapsulates the battle between totalitarianism and free thought, which reflected society's philosophical contest at the time. You might be wondering, don't a lot of books do that? Yes, but what separates these as novels of ideas are its enactment of competing philosophies at the time. Books like The Time Machine by H.G. Wells, Animal Farm, 1984, Brave New World, all depict philosophies that could have become the norm. Explorative novels of ideas, on the other hand, don't lay the table for established philosophies or competing philosophies of the time, but rather exemplify the leisure that we have now to explore new ideas. The struggle or the competing philosophies are really just the average person's understanding or attempts to understand the confusing world around us. My favorite of these explorative novels of ideas is Albert Camus' The Stranger. It is an accompanying novel to his philosophical essay, The Myth of Sisyphus. Very little happens in The Stranger. We follow a character named Meursault as he goes about his day over the course of a week or so. Very stream of consciousness, anti-plot sort of thing. But in it, we discover what it's like for a regular person to understand the confusing notion of the absurd. Albert Camus is known as the father of absurdism, a, at the time, new form of philosophy that extends from existentialism. And as existentialist Jean-Paul Sartre describes it, The Myth of Sisyphus, the philosophical essay by Albert Camus, gives us the notion or the academic definition of the absurd, whilst The Stranger gives us the feeling, a more ambiguous internal understanding of Albert Camus' philosophy. Whilst a novel of ideas is a poorly described, ambiguous, hard to understand category of novels, I think what makes it a novel of ideas instead of a philosophical essay or any other genre is the fact that it gives you a feeling of whatever philosophy it embodies. It could be reflective of the times or not, exploring new philosophies, but at the heart of it, it gives the reader a sense of what the philosophy is all about, rather than an academic or philosoph or essayist definition.